Good morning. Welcome everyone to the Center for Governance and Markets' first live virtual conversation, which is going to focus on the political upheaval currently taking place in Belarus. My name is Jennifer Brink Murtazashvili, and I'm the director of the Center for Governance and Markets, which is a research center just recently established here at the University of Pittsburgh. And just very briefly about our center, the mission of our center is to understand the diverse institutions and governance arrangements that affect social order and human well-being in the United States and around the world. We generate knowledge of ways in which individuals and communities overcome challenges to living free, prosperous, and people's lives. And we do this through cutting-edge research, by trying to bridge the gap with the policy world, and especially through community engagement. And that means that we believe the best way to understand what is going on in different societies around the world is not by sitting comfortably on our couches, but by engaging with people in their communities, where they work and where they live. The COVID crisis gave our center a bit of a crisis. How can we engage in communities while we are all under lockdown? So the internet has been a really important medium for us to connect with so many different voices around the world. And in the deep spirit and the deep belief that we have in this engagement, we saw the events unfolding in Belarus with enormous curiosity. But what has been missing from mainstream media narratives is the perspectives of people actually from Belarus. Here in the US, we've been peppered with panels featuring experts from NATO, the EU, Russia, discussions of Putin. But Belarus is not just a crossroads, it's a place. It's a place filled with people, their expectations, their families, their joys, and their sorrows. So we are so fortunate to have 4 eminent experts from Belarus who are the future of that country. And so let me introduce them very briefly, and I'm so grateful. We're all so grateful to have them here. We've put this panel together with extremely short notice. So let me introduce the 4 of them, and they'll speak in the order of introduction. So first is Dr. Andrei Kazakevich, who holds a PhD in political science and is the director of the Institute for Political Studies, Political Sphere in Minsk, where he's speaking with us today from Minsk. He's the editor-in-chief of the journal Political Studies, Political Sphere. He's a research fellow at Vytautas Magnus University in Kaunas, Lithuania, and he's the head of the organizing committee of Belarusian Studies. Next, we're delighted to have Tatiana Chulitskaya. She's a native of Belarus, but she lives and works in Vytautas Magnus University, also in Kaunas, Lithuania, where she serves in the Faculty of Political Science and Diplomacy. She received her PhD from the University of Vilnius in Lithuania in 2014, and she previously taught political science and public policy at the European Humanities University in Lithuania. In addition, she's very involved in activities of the Belarusian non-formal education and a project related to non-formal education at the school, and she's involved in the School of Young Managers in Public Administration. Next, we have Katerina Bornukova, and she's the academic director of Berot, which is the Economic Research Center based in Minsk. She holds an MA in economics from Kiev School of Economics and a PhD in economics from Universidad Carlos III de Madrid. Her research interests include macroeconomics, the economics of transition, and labor economics. She's an MBA professor at the IBM Business School in Minsk and previously served as a senior economic advisor to the UN resident rep in Belarus. She also works as a consultant for the World Bank and other international organizations. And last but very not least, we have Ryhor Nizhnikau, who's speaking to us from Helsinki. He's the Senior Research Fellow in the EU's Eastern Neighborhood and Russia program at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. He studies Russia's and the EU policy towards Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus, as well as domestic developments in these countries. His publications include a book, EU-induced institutional change in post-Soviet space, promoting reforms in Moldova and Ukraine, which came out from Routledge Press in 2018. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce, I'll let our speakers each speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to open things up to questions. So if any of the attendees who are here with us today have questions for the panelists, please send them to us during the course of our conversation, and we'll make sure the panelists see them. And just a brief note about the ordering. We're going to speak with Andrei, who's going to frame the general political situation in the country. Then we'll move on to Tatiana, who will speak to us about the political mobilization and youth mobilization. What's happening in Belarus is really fascinating from the perspective of social media and internet technologies. Katerina will provide an economic overview and talk about some of the challenges facing state-owned enterprises. And then Rihor will wrap things up with sort of a global perspective and helping us understand how the events in Belarus affect regional dynamics, how regional dynamics are affecting Belarus, and also the broader global implications of all of this. So without further ado, Andrei, please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you for possibility to speak here. I would like to make several introductory remarks concerning Belarusian political system in general at the beginning. We have a personalistic authoritarian political system. That means that we have strong power and strong men at the top of hierarchy and weak, extremely weak political institutions, except of bureaucracy. Actually, we have only one really strong political institution of Belarus is bureaucratic structures, bureaucratic bodies that control politics, control most of economic life, public state-owned enterprises, most of private companies more or less dependent on bureaucratic bodies. They are linked for many issues. We don't have any strong political parties, for instance, as most of countries in the world have. We don't have strong oppositional political parties. We don't have strong pro-governmental political parties. For instance, you can see. Oh, can I show PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
Okay. For instance, here you can see composition of Belarusian parliament for last 20 years. Representation of political parties is very low. Now it's higher than it was before, but it's still under 20%. Rest of MPs don't belong to any political parties. And at the same time, these political parties that are represented in parliament also were created on the basis of some bureaucratic organizations or organizations that are affiliated with bureaucracy. The same concerning professional representation. For instance, here you can see that absolute majority of MPs represent public sector. Some of them, affiliation of some of them are difficult to identify for 5%, and only 2 can be identified as representative of private sector. The same situation concerning local councils. Here you can see that the share of or representation of private sector is growing at some extent, but it's still very low, and public sector is dominated. in these local councils. So we have in Belarus really only one strong political institution that is bureaucracy, and Lukashenko as an authoritarian leader at the top of it. And in general, Belarusian politics is very simple because we don't have any other strong political institutions like parties, like civil society organizations. Of course, there are many independent political civil society organizations, but most of them are weak and isolated. They're not influential if we speak about any influence on decision making. If we speak about pro-governmental civil society organizations, so-called civil society organizations, most of them are affiliated with the state, and practically they are a part of this bureaucratic structure which was created during the period of independence. This model was deliberately created by Lukashenko, and actually this model is in a deep crisis now. And this model should be changed, and it seems that it's will be changed in the nearest future, but it's very difficult to predict how Belarusian political landscape will be in several months or in a year. So this simple domestic politics means or corresponds to very simple international affairs. Very simple in comparison with most other countries in Europe. Belarus is greatly dependent on Russia. Here, for instance, you can see a share of Russia in exports, and now it's practically the same as it was at the beginning of 90s, at the beginning of independence. And at the same time, the dependence on in other spheres is great. The influence of Russia on Belarusian elites is great, great cultural influence, and many other channels of influence are in Belarus and Russia relationships. This is the context, yeah. That's so. In general, Belarusian political system is very simple, and Belarusian foreign politics is very simple too. Bureaucracy dominates domestic politics. Russia dominates foreign policy. So in general, we have very simple structure of contemporary political crisis, because it's some kind of stalemate between protest movement and bureaucracy. Protest movement that is decentralized, that doesn't have any stable political leadership, and authorities try to destroy any signs of institutionalization of this movement, any concentration of its power or influence. And this movement tries to put pressure on the system, on Lukashenko through bureaucracy, to bring some changes in Belarus. All other political entities are weak, and it's very difficult for them to influence decisions and influence political development in Belarus. Bureaucracy now is in very difficult situation, because internal, because pressure within these structures is growing. This situation is very uncomfortable for them. They don't like politics, especially public speech and so on. It's very difficult for them to accept new political rules. They feel these protests feelings, and probably they feel that absolute majority of people want some kind of changes. This situation threatens their business interests, but at the same time, it's very difficult for them to find any real option, because they don't have any option to change their political affiliation, because any other all other political institutions are extremely weak. So it's really like a stalemate, because it's very difficult to find any mechanisms using by which, for instance, protest movement can change the situation. And at the same time, Lukashenko himself and Belarusian bureaucracy just don't have any strategy to solve this political crisis and to change current political model. That's probably all that I'd like to say.
Great, thank you. Tatiana.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for this interesting panel. I would start with the presidential elections, which happened on the August 19. Of course, all of you follow media agenda, and you see that events in Belarus are developing really fast, and it's really difficult to predict what happens next. But I will try to talk a bit about mobilization and civil society. So basically, from the very beginning, when elections were appointed in summer, probably the idea of authorities and of President Lukashenko was that it would be very silent and very calm elections without any particular candidates, any protest, anything. However, before the elections, situation had totally changed. Some unexpected candidates stepped into the campaign, and then with different developments at the end of the campaign, we had one so-called united oppositional candidate, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who is indeed a kind of accidental candidate, because she was not going to participate in elections at all. So it was a kind of a paradoxical situation when a strong, paternalistic, long-term authoritarian leader was facing face-to-face with a just quite ordinary, I should say, woman who didn't intend to participate in politics at all. So after the elections, you saw this protests on the street, and during the first days after elections, there was quite a lot of violence from the so-called militia and army and different sub-military institutions in Belarus. Then this violent protest was replaced by peaceful protest, and nowadays we see every day different kinds and types of this peaceful protest in Belarus, but also we see an extremely high pressure from authorities towards society. And now just several moments about this civic mobilization. So basically, even before the elections, we observe a kind of a unprecedented level of social mobilization, or I should say even politicization of Belarusian society. So it means that those Belarusian citizens who have never been interested in political agenda or political events, I mean, they were hardly reading news, they started to follow political events, political agenda. They started to participate in different rallies and so on and so forth. So the civic mobilization caused the biggest in the modern Belarusian history rallies on support of the oppositional candidates even before the elections. And we could talk basically about several reasons or several grounds of this mobilization. First of all, I should mention that from Tikhanovskaya's side, it was such a claim or desire for changes. So basically, she articulated expectations of Belarusians who do not want to live the same life as they lived before. Then after the elections, the grounds, like this grounds of desire for changes, they were added by protest against elections, falsification, and all kinds of frauds which happened during the elections. And also there were a lot of protests. I mean, like the ground for mobilization was protest against brutal violence of so-called siloviki. And also there is one very strong political request or political demand that Lukashenko should leave. He shouldn't stay in the power anymore. So it is important that it's not just Minsk, which was mobilized during this protest, but also all other cities, not just regional centers in Belarus, but some small towns or even like in several cases, villages were involved in the protest. So nowadays we see how citizens in different places are mobilizing themselves. They intend to create so-called self-governance. They try to negotiate with their authorities, with local authorities, and they're also creating the so-called strike committees. So basically we see down-up a process of mobilization in all regions of Belarus. And in spite of the tremendous violence against those who protest, we also observe a kind of a positive type of mobilization, which is used by the oppositional candidate. So supportive to the idea of the regime change people, they nowadays use different and very creative, I should say, forms of protest. For instance, you probably see these nice pictures with women of different age in white clothes and so on and so forth. Basically, nowadays, we could assume that peaceful and non-violent forms of protest are more preferable for the majority of Belarusians, while this any attempts of this violent protest, they were very harshly suppressed by the authorities. And the next very important point about social mobilization is labor protest movement and strikes. So post-electoral period is also characterized by the protest mobilization of workers of many enterprises. At the beginning, workers of the majority of the biggest enterprises, and not only in Belarus, they expressed their intentions to strike, and they formulated political demands to the authorities. So more or less, they demand the same: to stop violence, to remove Lukashenko, to remove the head of Central Electoral Committee, of some siloviki from their offices, and but the basic demand is to conduct new fair elections. However, nowadays we see a certain decrease in the workers' protest activities, which are caused by several reasons, in my opinion. So first of all, there are all kinds of pressure on the workers from the enterprises administrations. The second reason is that in Belarus, they have really restrictive legislation towards labor rights and rights to strike in particular. And the last but not the least is fear and lack of so-called protest experience of the workers themselves. However, when it comes to President Lukashenko, I would just make some points about mobilization from the authorities, which is going on also in Belarus nowadays. So we basically see that if at the beginning he was mostly thinking and mostly using this coercive mobilization. So basically, he made electoral committees very loyal to him. He made them to falsify a result of elections and so on and so forth. And basically before the elections, his main target group was army and all the military groups who are the main supporters and who are the main tool of his legitimacy provision. However, after the elections and after authorities, they used this violence against protesters. Nowadays, Lukashenko and authorities, they also changed their tactics towards protests, and basically they also trying a kind of this positive mobilization. So they basically try to conduct this mass rally in support of Lukashenko. However, people are forced to come to these rallies, and also the idea is that authorities want somehow to counterbalance this huge amount of people who were coming to support to the oppositional candidates. And unfortunately, I do not have time. I have just one word about social media. Social media plays a tremendous important role in the current protest, while there is no leader, of the protest itself. However, the whole mobilization and the whole coordination of the protest is going through social media and Telegram channel in particular, and it's a kind of innovative political communication tool in Belarus, which was not used in the previous campaigns. Authorities also try to use social media, but they are not so good with this in this sphere. But authorities still control so-called old media. Television, which is state-run and state-controlled totally, and this is the main tool of the authorities' propaganda. And I will probably stop here. But if you have any questions about media, I could reflect on them later on. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Tatiana. It was fascinating. And so very much related to these issues of protests are the roles, as Andrei has pointed out, the government controls so much of the economy in Belarus. The country never went through sort of the privatization that we saw throughout many parts of the former Soviet Union. So the state controls enterprises, it controls so many different aspects of the economy and society. And so now Katerina, as an economic expert, will talk about the role of these state-owned enterprises and the economic dimensions affecting what's happening right now.
Thank you for having me, and let me show you some slides. So what you see on this figure is GDP growth rates, annual GDP growth rates in Belarus, and 2020 is, of course, a forecast. So what you see here is that after a decade of very fast growth, which was pro-poor, meaning that it effectively decreased poverty and inequality in Belarus, we had basically a lost decade where 2011 was the last year of high economic growth, and then we went into the stagnation. And this stagnation led to the increase in the gap with Poland and the Baltic countries in the income gap, and also to the increase in inequality within Belarus. And this is the economic background which shaped a lot of political movement just a couple of months ago. So our country, as Andrei has already mentioned, depends on Russia economically in many ways. This is oil and gas price subsidies. This is trade. So 2/3 of our non-rent export goes to Russia. And the majority of what our state-owned enterprises produce actually is exported to Russia. Russia is also the lender of the last resort for Belarus. At least it used to be this lender just a year ago. And we also have unified labor markets. So what you see in this graph is GDP growth of Belarus, which tracks very closely Russia GDP growth. This dependence on Russia, again, it recently became more of a drag rather than a growth engine for Belarus. And to talk more about state-owned enterprises, here what you see on the graph is the employment share of state-owned enterprises in total employment in Belarus. This is only commercial enterprises, so it doesn't include the public sector, healthcare, and education, right? But what you see here is that its role has been diminishing quite quickly over the last years. So what happened is that basically the government's policy, which used to work just 10 years ago, where it pumped a lot of money into investment into state-owned enterprises, it stopped working because these enterprises became highly inefficient, and basically the return on capital has become even negative, not positive. And all these modernization efforts only led, in the recent years, only led to the accumulation of more and more debt. So these state-owned enterprises right now are highly indebted, and a lot of this debt is taken over by the government. So it has become public debt de facto. What we also see is that, again, in the past, state-owned enterprises played huge social role. So basically it provided guarantees for employment. Now this role is fading away because state-owned enterprises cannot, financially, they cannot keep a lot of excessive employment. And they are also very sensitive to the events in Russian economy. So what we see in the recent years is growth in inequality, also partly in inequality between people employed in state-owned enterprises and a more vibrant and growing private sector. And this was, of course, one of the reasons why there was a certain social economic tension growing over the past years in Belarus, and need for change was growing. And to talk slightly about what strikes and current strikes and protests mean for the Belarusian economy, well, we cannot say much about the range of these strikes right now, whether the enterprises are actually stopping or not. But just to give you a hint of what it could mean, one of the largest enterprises which went on strike, Belaruskali, is a potash salt extractor and potash fertilizer producer. And together with oil refineries, they generate almost 30% of Belarusian exports. So this is critical for foreign currency inflows in the country, and this is again critical for Belarusian economy in the moment. And just a couple of words of what was going on in the last half a year and what's going on right now. So what we have is a huge expansion of fiscal deficit, which was quite normal given the coronavirus associated crisis. So what we have in the updated forecast, pre-election updated forecast for the fiscal side is the 4.5% GDP deficit. This is big for Belarus, but this is something that we were able to handle at the moment before the election. Because the Ministry of Finance has accumulated some reserves over the past years. But the bad thing is that we didn't spend it on social assistance, on supporting people directly, but rather the government launched numerous bailouts for state-owned enterprises, which were forced to keep up output despite the inventories growing and despite financial losses growing. And it has also introduced some non-conventional monetary measures in order to make banks issue loans more actively. And all of this created a lot of financial risks for the economy of Belarus. And again, all of this happened pre-election, like in June, July, mostly. All of these risks accumulated. What we have right now, again, we have huge risks accumulated of state-owned enterprise insolvency, of the growth of bad debts, of growth of non-payments, and probably a full-fledged debt crisis. But again, pre-election fiscal sustainability in the short run was kind of secured by accumulated reserves. So, for example, our international currency reserves are almost 9 billion, and half of it, almost half of it, is the reserves accumulated by the Ministry of Finance over the previous years. So we looked, before the election, we looked safe for at least, half a year coming up to us. But right now, after the elections, in the moment, what we see is that there is basically there is a mild bank run. People are withdrawing their bank deposits, and the National Bank has to step up with emergency loans to the banks. We see that currency is slowly devaluating. Demand for foreign currency almost tripled, and the National Bank so far, we see signs that it's selling off its currency reserves. And just to give you an idea of how important what that might be, again, we have 9 billion of reserves, and in March, when the National Bank had to step up to protect the currency from the shocks of oil price decline and coronavirus, it spent 1 billion over a month. Now we are faced with a much larger shock, so we might lose a bigger chunk of the reserves, like right now, over this week, basically. We don't see the data right now, but the volumes of trades tell us that something, very dangerous is going on. And of course, in the much larger problems are coming up in the middle run, after the situation is resolved somehow, we are still left with the basically with the social contract brutally ruined, with the lack of trust to the government, which excludes any kind of investment, both foreign direct investment or from within the country. If there is no political change, again, if there is no political change, we are excluded from any kind of international financial organizations funding. We might face outflow of people and businesses from the country, and that basically, again, if no political change happens, in economic terms, we are left at the mercy of Russia, which is the only source of external funding we can hope for right now. So this is all for me. Thank you, and I will be happy to answer your questions. Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, did I stop sharing? Yeah.
Okay. Yes, thanks. It was fascinating just to see the extent of government ownership of the economy and the huge role government plays in the public sector and sector, very small private sector. You ended your remarks speaking about Russia and how dependent Belarus remains on Russia. So let's wrap things up with these with our remarks with Rihor, who's going to speak on foreign dynamics and regional and global dynamics.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well, first of all, it's really a pleasure to be a part of this brilliant panel. Let me start with, I will try to actually connect to what has been said, and I largely agree with previous statements. But let me start with where the regime is heading to. So I will say that, in my opinion, the Lukashenko's time is over, but not yet. So we can currently see that the regime has recovered from the previous shock, that it has stabilized its support among elites. It has gained the crucial support from Moscow, which would allow him to go through these very turbulent times and win this survive, let's put it this way, survive this round of confrontation with the society. But it is not sufficient to basically keep Lukashenko in place for the next, in the medium term. So we will see his departure. We don't know when, but this is where the question of the role of the external action becomes crucial, because the terms of his departure, the way how the Belarus will look in after him, and the way how the political system will evolve in the next month and years, something that Andrei has pointed out, it's unsustainable and it will definitely change. So this process will be very strongly influenced from outside of Belarus. And I will try to probably say over potential scenarios how it's gonna unravel. First of all, and one important thing, most important thing perhaps, why he will not stay, I just want to underline this. Basically, the gap between the society and the archaic regime, which basically caused actually this protest, caused this crisis, will be impossible to bridge. So the society, this modernizing Belarusian society, will not accept him in any form in the medium future. But there are a lot of questions how the things can go. And again, the external powers will play a crucial role in the outcome of these processes and the trajectory of Belarus. First of all, the current events and the current crisis is another test for the European Union, for its ability to react and act. It doesn't look good at the moment. I think that we again see that the EU has been caught by surprise, despite several warnings. It currently has no strategy. Its current approach, which it has pursued in the last 5 years, engagement with the regime and normalization of ties for geopolitical reasons after the Russian war began against Ukraine, it's no longer acceptable, but we see very slow and weak reaction so far. So it needs to revise its approach drastically and very fast. But we so far see that what has been done is really insufficient. At least in comparison with what Moscow has been doing. It can really do more, and I will come back to that by the end of my remarks. Russia, at the same time, has really an upper hand in this current process. We probably can say that it has been it was also surprised by the way Lukashenko regime was shaken, but we can clearly see that it rallied around, or at least started to support him quite early on. Why it supported Lukashenko? I think there are several reasons. First, something which are related to Russian domestic politics. On one hand, we can definitely say that Russia will not accept any protest-driven regime change. So for them, this is even if Putin doesn't believe that, for part of his elite, it is a color revolution. And if he will accept this, that would really sort of damage his position within the country, among his own elites, and will probably send their own signal to the public as well. At the same time, we clearly see that Lukashenko is a lesser of evils for Putin in Belarus at the moment. There have been a lot of grudges with him over the last, not only 5 years, but over the last 25 years. Between, well, 25 is a bit too much, but between 20 years since Putin became president in Russia. But at the same time, there's been a constant process of institutionalization of the relationship. So Russia was slowly but steadily gaining ground, something that Katerina has just brilliantly showed by all her graphs, and something Andrei also mentioned before. So we talk not only about political or economic, but also political and also societal strong ties and connections, and particularly among security elites. And one important factor, which probably is sometimes omitted, is that Lukashenko shielded his domestic politics from Russian influence. So if we imagine that Russia would really want to go and replace him now, they have no one to replace him with. So there is no really a person like in Moldova, Dodon, or a person in Ukraine. We can come up with a couple of names that can just, they say this is our candidate whom we really trust. So at the moment, Lukashenko is really lesser of evils, and they will support him. We really see that the support is really looking quite strong. I probably would like to underline that we will not have something like Russian intervention in Belarus. That's too costly, too unpredictable, causes a lot of trouble, and basically for what? So they will not go that far. But they have already done enough to rally Belarusian elites, which we might argue started to sort of a question in the key days of Belarusian protest against the regime, what to do, question their loyalty and their place. So they rallied them around by their support, verbal and actually, let's call it material. They clearly send messages to Belarusian security services to do the same. They send signals and direct messages to the West to actually stay away and not engage too far. They also started to support the regime by sending clear, let's say, by trying to influence Belarusian society. All this propaganda, which has been really heavily launched in the last days on the Russian TV channels, supports Lukashenko and his perspective on this protest. The core question probably where Russia, what it will do next. So in my opinion, what we can see, and clearly that would happen, they will really, first of all, participate, engage heavily in the transformation of the Belarusian political system. So we will have probably sort of a departure from the personalist regime. We will see much more power sharing. We will create new power sharing arrangements where the Belarusian elites will get finally some institutional power, and where Russia will demand its piece of cake. So the first thing would be to put their people, trusted people, into these new institutions to actually facilitate the takeover politically of the country, keep it under control after Lukashenko departure. So they will have to prepare the grounds for that. So for them, it's a perfect exit strategy for Lukashenko and for creating Russia-oriented Belarus without with a very predictable leadership, without paying too much for that. So we will definitely not see anything drastic on their side. Perhaps, I'm saying perhaps because this is, we know that sometimes decisions are made in Russia irrationally, and we cannot exclude that. I would not see any possibility for Russia to actually allow EU to have a say. It's again, Lukashenko is not Plahotniuk, so it's not a Moldova scenario. Again, in Moldova, there were no protests last year in June. So again, it was a very technocratic change. And technically, Moldova was a pro-European country. So that was a different story. Belarus is the closest ally. They can't have EU to be able to define its future. That's, again, a very wrong message to send. In the last minute, I will come back to what the EU can do. I don't expect much, and I think that will be a disaster for the EU, another disaster in the post-Soviet space. But we have to understand that first they have really to come up with a strategy, nuanced, well-defined, and clear, to send message to domestic elites that they have a future in Europe in a sense. Because I would like to, in a sense, they don't have leverage now, but have a lot of carrot to offer to these elites. And to probably end up on a positive note in this kind of a probably sober picture, I would say that something that gives hope to the European Union is that Lukashenka and big chunk of his elite are extremely afraid of Moscow's increased engagement and heavier involvement in Belarusian domestic affairs, because they know quite well what it can actually lead to, and that their basically economic and political assets can be quickly stripped off. So they should really have this on the table from the European Union, but most importantly, the EU should really engage domestic public. So we see that there are no EU flags, there are no pro-EU slogans. It is a domestic revolution, let's put it this way. But these people still don't know where to go, and the EU should heavily get engaged with the society to make sure that at least a big chunk of these people will, when the time will come, will demand also pro-European Belarus, not just, will be left without any alternative to keeping things as usual or heavily getting closer related to Moscow. I'll stop here, and I'll be very happy to discuss these issues in detail. Thanks a lot.
So thanks to all of you for such insightful comments. And we've gotten so many questions in from the audience, but several of them actually, Rihor, really reflect some of the issues that you have raised. So very briefly, I just want to have a quick follow-up with you specifically, because we have so many viewers here from the United States. There's a big question about what role the US should play in all of this. And one question suggests maybe the US should play a secondary role behind the EU to mediate the conflict. Should the US play a secondary role behind the EU? Or should the US play a more active role in what's going on?
Well, thanks a lot. Probably the fact that I didn't speak about the US means that there is really, it's not a factor at the moment, fortunately or unfortunately. I wouldn't talk about secondary, or they should really, the West should be in tandem. IMF, US, EU, all of them have their influence and a lot to actually offer to Belarus, especially when it's been decided what Belarus is going to look like. This is the question which probably Lukashenko elite are really asking now, even if he stays for a while still. So I think that the US, first of all, should really coordinate their efforts with the EU. So the EU might be in the front seat simply because it has had a policy for a while towards Belarus, while US-Belarus relations has been frozen for quite a while and has been recently only, let's call it unfrozen for a bit. So they should really coordinate, and they should really sort of stand behind together, because the only way, this is the only way how, let's say, Moscow might be also impacted. Because we clearly see that Moscow thinks Belarus as its own, let's say, its own, how to say, I don't like the sphere of influence, but it's closest ally, doesn't want anyone else but them to decide what Moscow, what Minsk and what Belarusian future will look like. So in this regard, the coordinated efforts of the West shall at least say that, send the message to Moscow that it's Belarusian people who will decide in the future what they really want to be, not you, and this is what we stand for. So I think the US can play a role, but with current administration, we clearly see that there is no policy and there will be no policy soon.
Great, thank you. So now I just want to open up things to all of you, and this is actually a question that I have. We have seen such enormous social mobilization take place, and I think one of the assumptions that that we're reading about is because the opposition movement is really apolitical. It's not really an opposition, it's an opposition to the president, but it actually doesn't have a positive agenda except for removing Lukashenka, having new elections in 6 months. And do you think that the is this sustainable, this kind of opposition? Will it break apart over time? And if it changes, how will it change? And then how will that affect dynamics within the country? Anybody can jump in.
Okay, probably. Can I?
Oh, Andrei, yes.
Uh, I think it will be sustainable until Lukashenko is in power. Because yes, you're right that actually Lukashenko is the common enemy, and now people with very different social background, with very different political views, just do something together. But of course, it's just because of this our very simple political system, and it's because of protests against Lukashenko personally, his abuse of power, and his and his policy. So, of course, this movement will be splitted after regime change somehow. Yeah, and I think that some kind of institutionalization of different new political or civil society organizations will take place.
Yeah, if I may jump in, Jennifer?
Yes.
Yeah, I totally share Andrei's approach. I also think that like this kind of apolitical opposition will stay as long as Lukashenko is in power, because like the main motivation is this desire of changes. So like until Lukashenko is someplace, there are no changes. I mean, in this simplified picture of the world. However, I would like to point out very interesting moment here about the very concept of opposition in Belarus, because nowadays, I mean, I need to develop it more, but nowadays what I observe, the people, they are not saying about themselves as opposition. They are saying that, you know, we are just civic activists, we are just people, we are just ordinary people who want changes. And it's quite interesting interpretation, because for a long time, the very word opposition was a kind of a very bad word in official, but also in public opinion. So like opposition was something bad. And nowadays, I mean, people just even do not want to call them opposition, even if de facto they, of course, they are opposition. So it's just a small remark.
Yeah, and now the different word is used: alternative political forces or alternative, and so not opposition but alternative political forces.
And how long do you think that's sustainable? I mean, that's really quite unusual. You know, if we look at other countries in the world that have gone through these kinds of upheavals, having a group that's united in such a way as an alternative without a, I don't want to say a positive political agenda, but without a, you know, an articulation of, you know, specific demands. Actually, a question we have here, you know, can you talk a bit more about the specific demands put forth by the protesters beyond a new election? But it's our sense from speaking to you that this alternative is really not focused on setting an agenda right now, but instead focused with laser-like precision on removal of the president and new elections.
Yes, and you know, this approach is very useful, just not to divide people in Belarus, because there is a risk of civil conflict actually, and this apolitical approach, it's a good way just to avoid such confrontation. This is the first point. And the next point, as I have mentioned during my presentation, we just have very weak political institutions. There is no experience of political life or democratic political life in Belarus. And for many persons that are engaged in these protests, it's quite natural to be apolitical, you know, because for them it's very difficult to understand, you know, some positive agendas, some ideologies, and so on. The only aim that they see is just to remove Lukashenka and or maybe even remove authoritarian system. But it's very difficult for them to understand some details.
Tatiana.
Yes, and just to add that what we see, it's also quite interesting that this leaders of opposition, they are changing. I mean, starting from the beginning of electoral campaign, nowadays we have quite different shapes of this opposition. If at the beginning it was several candidates, then there was like a reunion of different candidates who were not registered. Nowadays we have like Tikhanovskaya brought and all this stuff, but I would say that because of this kind of nomadic identity of this oppositional leaders group, it's changing all the time, somehow reflecting maybe expectations of the people, or reflecting expectations of the public towards them.
I will, if I may, just a quick thing, because I think your question is really crucial about sustainability. And the history of Belarusian opposition is not actually positive on this question. We know that they really start to argue quite fast. So the more the time goes, the higher are the chances that there will be splits, probably even defections, because the regime will be quite successful in co-opting some of them or threatening some of them, because we also, we know that from the history of that they're quite well trained in that. But this, I will totally agree with Tatiana, and this is crucial, that this grassroots mobilization, this civic rise, you can't put it back in the bottle. So this is what is the crucial this time, and this is what really will lead to the demise of this regime, that they can't really crack it down. And there will be a lot of going on at least on the local level. That will of course go up and down, but they will just have there will be just another trigger, something like COVID, that would spill it over. And the next election, let's say, which I don't think will have Lukashenko on the ballot box. If he will be there, there will be another before the election. So we're just waiting. But for the opposition, they will try. I still think they're very weak. They're try to be inclusive, but many we can see already declined to join or were not invited. And this is a problem, because if you remember, they formed coordination council for something that you probably haven't heard or followed yet, where they try to include as many people as possible. But we know that they really try to follow Bolotny example, where they try to have something like that. And we remember Bolotny example in Russia, that they really started to argue with themselves quite fast. But we also remember the Ukrainian Maidan example in 2013, 2014, when they had the same structure. And we remember that it was much more inclusive. So this is the problem. We see that some of the key actors, which might be not very acceptable for some reasons, maybe they are too radical, etc. In Ukraine, they were part of this. So this will create, a lot of trouble, and will just probably lead to, there will be a first example, but something will follow afterwards. So I wouldn't be have too much hope on these leaders. Some of them are just here by, somewhat by chance, and are more of a symbols than leaders at the moment. But who knows? Let's see. Thank you.
I should note that I mentioned to all of you before, but to all of our viewers right now, that yesterday I did an interview with former presidential candidate Yaroslav Romanchuk, who ran for president against Lukashenko in 2010. He had quite a difficult time as a consequence of that, but he was quite optimistic about this current movement and its ability to stay together. And that also surprised me. Because we know what can happen with these kinds of situations. It's so tenuous, which leads me to a question for Katerina. Given all of the current economic dimensions, the role of the state-owned enterprises, how much of the economy is really controlled by the state, the COVID crisis, all of these tremendous economic shocks that the country is facing, the length of this, it seemed like 2 weeks ago or a week ago that Lukashenko's removal might have been eminent. right? There were so many protests on the street, hundreds of thousands. Now he seems like he's consolidating his power and is developing a strategy for the long haul. But given the economic dynamics that you have described, that there really seems to be a tension there. And I'm wondering if you could say just a little bit about the economic dynamics and how you think that those issues, especially related to many of the issues that you raised during your fascinating presentation, will affect this movement as it goes forward. Will it fragment because of these economic dimensions?
Well, first of all, about the power of the state controlling the economy. Yes, indeed, there is, well, formally that there is at least half of the economy which is either public or commercial state-owned enterprises. But the question is, how well can we control them? Because this is all about their financial state, especially if we talk about the state-owned enterprises. And they were already overextended before the election because of COVID. And right now, I don't think there is a big move for maneuver if, you know, if the economy, well, and certainly economy is going into a huge crisis due to the events. I don't think that there is a lot of maneuver left to, you know, to stop this from happening without significant external funding. And again, there is no place to get this funding right now. As for the private sector perspectives, they are certainly, well, without any political change, they're certainly very dark. Everyone is depressed and no one is going to, you know, it's not even about new investment. It's mostly about losing all the things that we have achieved over the past years with the economic stabilization and business liberalization, building the high-tech park, IT sector, etc. This is suddenly it all might disappear from our landscape. And this is a big challenge. This is, of course, a huge challenge because economic issues, they were still, you know, they're not as prominent right now because of all the lack of law over the last months that we have seen, but they were the driving force before, and all the opposition candidates that are now either in jail or exiled from the country, they were talking about economic issues, and these issues are not going to go away. They're just going to get worse, and this is a huge challenge ahead. So I think that would shape a lot the political situation if Lukashenko stays over.
Right, and so it's my understanding right now that we're not seeing the demonstrators really speak a lot about these economic issues. I mean, it's so focused on the election. Do you think that that will affect the protest movement going forward? Or is my understanding of this just incorrect?
Well, I think right now the reestablishment of, you know, basic law and order is much more relevant to the protesters to reestablish our dignity and our rights. This is much more relevant right now than some economic issues, but it will certainly return to the agenda once we get over it.
Tatiana, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just to add that from the point of view of authorities, sorry, and official propaganda, they're basically using this argument, I mean, this economic argument. They're saying to workers that, you know, if you stop enterprises, there would be a huge economic damage. So, I mean, like in official discourse, this threat, I mean, economic threat, it exists.
Right. And Katerina, could you say a little bit more? I know we've had some questions about the IT sector. The IT sector, for those of you who don't know, has been a really important engine of Belarusian economic growth over the past several years. And your comment suggested that this could be under threat, or your previous comment suggested that we could see some migration outward from the country. And I imagine this would be one population that's easy to move.
Yes, indeed. This is a population which is easy to move. These are the people that are in demand in other countries. And these are companies that are, that are capable to move. And largest Belarusian IT companies, they already have offices in neighboring countries. So it will not be very difficult for them, quite easy to understand for them how to do that. And these are also the people that are more sensitive to what happened. So they are right now, I think they're much more in shock from what happened than the rest of the population. I should also note that, the largest IT companies, they have seen their employees beaten and tortured last week. So they have already launched relocation programs for the employees and their families. So we are already seeing that. And, I think we will see much more. Of course, not everyone would leave, but a lot of them would leave Belarus at this year or maybe upcoming years as well.
So we actually have a question here about China. A lot of questions here about foreign relations. A question, so I'll just ask a couple of questions and open it up to all of you. Should Belarus expect any financial support from China, its new economic partner? Do you think that this protest could speed up the integration of the Union State and the Eurasian Economic Union? I think these are two questions looking at sort of the regional dynamics, the Eurasian Economic Union, Union State, and then the role of China. China looms large in many parts of the world. So I'd be curious to hear your views on that. And then there's also questions about what the international community could do. We've got several questions about what the international community could do. And I think you've all addressed that to some extent.
I will probably start if you allow. Regarding China, I think it's very important. We cannot really say for sure what China will do, and I think China will most likely just wait and see. And we can say that Lukashenko for them is again quite a convenient partner, and for a number of reasons. Primarily, he has been one of the probably most proximate ideologically to the Chinese regime. So there is always a talk about Lukashenko political system, dictatorship with an economy which has socialist and market economy elements. So that's quite close to China, and then personal relationship, which we can say has been established in over this last 2 decades between China and. So for them, this is a quite reliable political partner, Belarus. But I would say they will not really invest heavily in what they would consider to be failing regime. So I would say that they may provide some support, especially financial. I think that Katerina is totally right that there will be no support, no economic resources on the Western financial markets and from the Western IFIs. But China can definitely give some money, and they are definitely will take something for that. Like they will be very happy to get some of the let's call it industrial champions or some share in some key projects. So I think what has been really important about China is that it was the first to congratulate on his victory, and they never questioned that. And I think that also sent signals to Moscow, and I will just bridge to Moscow. Eurasian Economic Union is a failure, and Moscow lost its interest in it. But what the Union State gonna look like, this I think an open question, which has been discussed in the last years. We know about this roadmaps, which Lukashenko tried to stall, but which is still has been approved on deeper integration. And I would say that the weak Lukashenko regime offers a lot of opportunities, and we'll see some real work done on that. And probably I still wouldn't say that the Union State where Belarus will become a part of Russia, it's unacceptable and it will not happen. And I would say primarily for Russian domestic audience reaction, because Russian domestic audience reaction is Russian audience, Russian people are what we know are against this kind of things. They don't think that Belarusians are Crimeans like. Crimeans for them were Russians, which Putin saved. Belarusians are different people. They are the most friendly, they are the most, and for Russian people, it will be like, why should we pay for them? Why should we really, our financial situation is really bad, our salaries go down. So Putin will not do this, but he wants really predictability. He wants really to put on a tight, rope. How is it? And weak Lukashenko and Belarus without Lukashenko, this, I would call it linear trajectory, allows Russia to have a lot, to improve its positions really a lot. And to start with, really tighten, probably institutionalize properly and very deeply security services of two countries, so that there will be very little independence of key security agencies in the future. I think that's what they would love to do, and that's what we can probably expect. That's the West. It's a different topic, but others can probably go in.
I'd like to add probably. Okay.
Go ahead. Yes, please.
Personally, I think that we will see some kind of stagnation concerning development of this Eurasian Union and even Union State of Belarus and Russia because of this political instability, and probably influence of Russia will grow. But institutionally, I don't think that any real changes will take place during these difficult times. But at the same time, I'd like to underline that this situation concerning Russia, integration with Russia, will be greatly dependent on active or passive position of European Union and United States. It will depend on policy and approach that European Union and West in general will implement concerning Belarus. And I think that there are a great number of mechanisms to balance Russia during this crisis. And this is probably the additional point why I think that there were no any real institutional changes concerning relationship of Belarus and Russia, except probably security sector, as was mentioned by Rigor.
Okay, because we have a question here. What is your estimation of the chance of a Russian intervention, either by conventional military or hybrid operations?
If I may.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will just say, I just said that it's totally would be a fantastic scenario. I don't think for, again, Russian domestic reasons, as well as really the price tag it will basically bear. Russia doesn't want to, it sort of is something it learned from Ukraine, that this kind of uncalculated actions really can cost. So Belarus is already so close that you can only make things worse if you do something like that. So there will be more nuanced, more gradual policy, and I agree with Andrei. After all this sort of things, all this acute stage of a crisis will sort of calm down.
Yes, I agree. I think it will be a disaster for Russia, such military involvement. But at the same time, Russia has a great number of mechanisms to influence Belarus without any military intervention. So I think it's scarcely possible, such military intervention.
Tatiana.
Yeah, and I agree with Andrei and Ryhor, but I would like to mention that nowadays there are a lot of speculations on this topic of Russian intervention, especially in the Western media, but not only Western. For instance, here in Baltic countries, it's really perceived as a threat of like Russian intervention in Belarus and then further, to the West, to these countries. I think that this evaluation should be a bit more realistic. There should be more evidence and less conspiracy towards these ideas, because nowadays we definitely see more speculation than political analytics here or international analytics here, and it would be very useful not just to make this additional conspiracy around this topic, while in Belarus there are a lot of very big problems except this Russian intervention. And maybe just the last point is about what could be done by the Western countries. It's just, kind of a discursive turn, but it's essential. It would be very good if Belarus would be presented in international discussion as an agent, as an agency, as political actor, not just, as a country in the sphere of Russian interests. Because, from the point of view of realpolitik, of course, if we approach international relations in this, from this direction, it's totally understandable. However, I think that a bit more constructivist approach is needed here. For Belarus itself to experience this agency, but also for different world powers. For US, EU, and all other China to accept Belarus in a bit other way.
Okay, great. So there's one final question, and this is from your good friend Artyom Schreibman, who has written, and he's inviting all of you to speculate. And you're free to pass if you don't want to speculate on this question. But he asks, now where did he go? What will happen? What do you think? He hid that I answered his question. Okay, what kind of events could force Lukashenko to consider power transfer? What events? Please speculate.
The main event, or the main tool, or how to say, to influence Lukashenko, it's international pressure. Actually, I don't think that it's about internal developments only, and I think that only internal actors like Russia, European Union, United States, and especially coalition of these countries can force him go. But and the next mechanism, or the next scenario, is just some kind of pressure within the system. But in general, I think it's scarcely possible without any involvement of foreign powers. Unfortunately, no, because of course I hope in general that we Belarusians will find some solution of this crisis without any foreign intervention. But it seems that for Lukashenko, it's just it's not the option, and the only force that can force him to go, it seems it's for foreign powers.
Anyone else want to speculate on the factors that would cause Lukashenko to leave?
But is it just, the question is that it's a very good question, but the question is, of course, is it a question of now or we talk about medium term? Because for now, I think he will be quite resolute and defined to from his character as well, and given that he understands that he actually has quite okay position for a moment. He is not a long-term planner. He is basically acts for what happens now and how it's going to look tomorrow. So for now, he sees that this domestic protest will not topple him. They are absolutely will not lead to anything at the moment. The Western pressure, he can basically not pick up the phone calls from Merkel, and that's why he understands that there will be really nothing coming, nothing serious coming from the West, which can really change the current situation unfavorably. And most importantly, he has his elite more or less rallied around him. They're asking questions about the future, but currently they're with him, and Russia backs it up. So this is really fine situation. In the medium term, as I said, I don't think that, I think he goes, but I think he will go on his own term. And after this all over, I think he'll get a lot of hints, options, but he will have probably a chance to leave kind of on his own terms with saving his face. But this is, again, it's a speculation. Many factors can intervene. We don't know how the situation will go. Let's say whether he will try again to, cheat on Moscow after it helped him, how would Moscow reacts to that, whether he will actually, again, try to cheat on his elites, which sort of expecting some power sharing now, finally, and some transition from personalist dictatorship. So there is a lot of unknowns, but I think it's a game done and how we're gonna go. I can say, but it will be, I think, quite incorrect in public to say that. So just leave it here. We can discuss it with Artem later.
Yes, okay. All right, so actually we've hit 11:30 our time. I know it's late over there. And so that's a perfect timing to wrap things up. And I just want to thank all of you, our viewers, for watching us. I want to extend enormous gratitude to these four panelists for agreeing to join us at a late hour in Belarus and in Lithuania and in Finland, where they are located. We're so grateful to hear your voices, and just enormous gratitude to all of you for joining us today. We'll be posting this video online in the next couple of days so that other people can watch it. And in the meantime, if any of you out there have more questions for our panelists, we will be providing their contact information. I'm sure you can easily find them online already, but please do not hesitate to reach out to them if you'd like to follow up. There are wonderful experts from Belarus who can speak about what's happening there. And so we're happy to provide them this platform here today. So thank you again, and have a wonderful evening. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Sure.
Bye.
Thank you for hosting us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. We'll be in touch. Okay. So grateful. We won't, yes. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.